Honoria Vane folded her napkin so carefully that the linen barely whispered against the table. No one at the dinner noticed. But she noticed the moment her husband said it, and everything in her went very still. He had been speaking to Mr. Alton, the railroad commissioner from Philadelphia, a broad-shouldered man with the practiced ease of someone who collected powerful friends the way other men collected debts. The evening had been built for exactly this kind of meeting. Honoria had known that since Tuesday, when she had rearranged the seating 3 times to ensure that Alton sat near enough to feel included, but not so near the head of the table that her husband's business partners from Savannah would read it as a slight. She had placed the flowers herself. She had approved the menu. She had redirected the conversation twice already from topics that would have made the evening uncomfortable in ways her husband would never have known to anticipate. And then Mr. Alton had complimented the house. And her husband, Ellsworth, had turned toward the foot of the table and said, "You are too kind. Much of this is owed to my sister's good taste. You must let me introduce Miss Honoria." The table did not freeze. It hesitated. Mrs. Alton's fork paused halfway to her lips. Dr. Pierce, who sat 3 chairs to Honoria's left and was the only man at the table who had ever asked for her opinion on anything, went very still. Her husband's business partner Graves looked down at his plate with the deliberate attention of a man who has decided not to be involved. Honoria smiled. She smiled the way she had been smiling for 9 years. Warm. Untroubled. The smile of a woman who has heard a small confusion and found it entirely beneath concern. "Mr. Alton," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach without effort, "I'm glad the house suits you. I hope the lamb does as well." The kitchen was particularly careful this evening. Alton laughed, pleased by the redirect. His wife looked at Honoria across the table with an expression that carried a complete conversation inside it, woman to woman, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Ellsworth had already turned back to the commissioner. He had not corrected himself. He had not noticed he hadn't. Dr. Pierce found her in the corridor near the library door 20 minutes later, while the men moved toward brandy and the women gathered in the parlor. Honoria had excused herself quietly, the way she always did, with such practiced ease that no one registered she was gone until she was already elsewhere. She was standing with her back to the window, hands loose at her sides, her face entirely composed. "That was a slip," Pierce said, because he was a man who believed in saying the difficult thing plainly. "Yes," Honoria said. Honoria. He was tired. He has had a long week with the Savannah contracts. It happens. Not like that. Pierce's voice was quiet, not with that ease. Not in front of commissioners and half the county. "I am fine, Arthur." He looked at her for a long moment. "You look like a woman making a calculation." She said nothing. "What are you calculating?" "Whether to go back in." A pause. "I'll go back in." The Alton woman looks like she might attempt a recitation if no one intercepts her, and the coffee timing needs managing, Honoria. "Good evening, Arthur," she said, not unkindly, and walked back toward the parlor. He watched her go with the expression of a man watching a decision happen from the outside. The guests departed by 10. Honoria saw each of them out with the right words for each person. A particular reference to Mr. Alton's recent testimony before the State Board, which he had not expected anyone to have read. A gentle reminder to Mrs. Graves that her daughter's recital was next Thursday, which Honoria had noted from a mention 3 months prior. A warm handshake for old Dr. Pierce that held a fraction longer than the others. She thanked everyone for the honor of their company. She meant it with precision rather than warmth, which was close enough. Ellsworth stood beside her for the final farewells. He smelled of brandy and looked satisfied. His hand rested briefly at the small of her back, while the commissioner descended the front steps. She noted the hand, the way you note the weight of your own coat. When the last carriage disappeared down the drive, Ellsworth exhaled and stretched his neck and said, "That went better than I expected." "It did," Honoria said. Alton seemed receptive. "I'll follow up on Thursday." He responded well to the mention of the Richmond water infrastructure argument. He's been on record supporting expansion. If you lead with that in your letter, he'll read it more carefully. Ellsworth looked at her briefly, the way a man glances at a clock. Good thinking. He was already reorganizing the evening into its useful parts. "Will you tell Drummond to have my horse ready at 7? I want to get to the mill before noon." "Of course." He went inside. Honoria stood on the front steps alone for a while. The Georgia night was thick and warm, full of the sound of the creek and insects and the distant passing of a freight train on the line 3 miles east. She had learned the schedule of that line 2 years ago because it affected the timing of certain deliveries to the estate. And because knowing things, all things, had always been the only way she could make everything work. She stood there until she was certain he was upstairs. Then she went inside and spoke to Drummond, and thanked the kitchen staff by name, and walked through the ground floor the way she always did after an evening. Checking windows, extinguishing lamps, noting what would need attention in the morning. She stopped in the dining room. 16 chairs, all slightly displaced from their original positions. She could have told you exactly who had sat where by the angle of each one. The commissioner always pushed back when he stood. Mrs. Alton had spent the evening turned 3 degrees toward the head of the table. Honoria stood at the foot of the table for a long moment. Then she went upstairs. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the house, settle and thought about the word sister. Not the word itself, the ease of it. The way it had arrived in Ellsworth's mouth without friction, without any sense that the name he was attaching to the woman at the foot of his table mattered enough to get right. His sister had died of typhoid 7 years ago. Honoria had attended that funeral. She had organized the flowers. She thought about the year they had married. She had been 23, he had been 35, and considerable in the way men of property and purpose were considerable, certain of their position, generous in the way men who had never lacked for anything were generous. He had not been unkind. He was not unkind now. That was the part she kept arriving at, the part that made everything harder to name. There was no cruelty to point to. No dramatic wound. Only 9 years of being necessary and unseen, like a well-maintained bridge that everyone crossed without thinking about the engineering. She had told herself it was the nature of this kind of marriage, that she had understood the arrangement when she entered it, his name and his standing and his household, for her competence and her company, that this was a reasonable trade and she was a reasonable woman. She had told herself this so many times it had almost become true. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, in the heat of a Georgia summer, Honoria Vane stopped telling herself that story. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of resolution, no door swinging open, no particular feeling of release. It was quieter than that, more like a hand finally unclenching something it had been gripping. For so long the grip itself had become invisible. She got up. She did not pack like a woman in crisis. She did not weep over objects or scramble through drawers in the dark. She moved through her dressing room with the same efficient calm she brought to everything, working by a single candle, choosing with care. Her own correspondence, bundled and tied. Letters from her mother in Macon. Letters from 2 women in Atlanta she had quietly helped navigate the legal questions surrounding their late husband's commercial properties, because she had known how and they had not. And because asking Ellsworth to be involved would have required explaining why she had opinions about property law, which would have required a conversation she had never been invited to have. Her own financial records, kept in a small ledger, Ellsworth had never opened because the larger accounts always arrived correct and he had never needed to look. Her grandmother's ring, 2 dresses, practical ones, her winter coat, despite the July heat, because she was thinking past the season. She paused over a small framed photograph, her wedding portrait, taken in the first year, when things had still felt possible in a way that didn't require management. She looked at the woman in it for a moment, young and composed, already holding her expression with the careful precision of someone who had understood early that composure was the only currency available to her. She set it on the dressing table face up. The letter she left was 4 sentences. I have managed this house and this marriage with everything I had. I am not leaving in anger. I am leaving because staying has required me to disappear, and I find I am no longer willing. The accounts are in order. You will find everything you need in the study. She did not sign it your wife. She signed it Honoria. She placed it on his breakfast tray and went downstairs and walked out the back door with her bag, and did not look at the house from the lane. It was 4 miles to the rail station at Calhoun Crossing. She knew the road well. The morning train came through at 5:30. She walked. Ellsworth Vane found the letter at 7:15. His housekeeper had set the tray as requested, and propped the envelope against the coffee service, and said nothing, because she was a woman who had worked in large houses long enough to recognize the kind of mourning that required silence before it required explanation. Ellsworth read it twice. The first time with the focused attention of a man searching for the part that would make it resolve into something manageable. The second time, because the first time had not produced that part. He set it down, drank his coffee, then said to the empty room, with the confident tone of a man who has correctly identified a misunderstanding, "She's gone to her mother's." He went to the mill. He did not send a telegram to Macon that afternoon. He sent it the following morning, After an evening in which dinner had arrived in the wrong order, and he had spent 3 hours in his study with the persistent sensation that something in the house had gone wrong in a location he could not identify. His mother-in-law replied in 2 days. "Honoria is not here." Ellsworth read those 4 words standing in the front hallway, and the thing that had been a low irritation sharpened suddenly into something else. Not quite fear. The particular discomfort of a man who has been entirely certain he understood a situation, and has just discovered he did not understand it at all. He sent for Arthur Pierce. Pierce arrived the following afternoon and listened to Ellsworth explain the situation with the controlled calm of a man who believed controlled calm was always the correct register. "She left," Ellsworth said, "without telling me where she was going. I need to find her." Pierce sat across from him and said nothing for a moment. "She wrote you a letter, vague, emotional. You know how she—" "What did it say, Ellsworth?" Ellsworth handed it across the desk. Pierce read it. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. "She said she was leaving. People say things when they're upset. Honoria Vane does not say things she doesn't mean." Pierce set the letter down with care. "You know that better than I do. She'll be back within the week. She's making a point." "What point?" "I don't know. That's why I need to find her." Pierce was quiet for a long moment. Long enough to become its own kind of statement. "What?" Ellsworth said. "I'm deciding how to say this in a way that will actually reach you." He leaned forward slightly. "At dinner last week, you introduced your wife to a railroad commissioner as your sister. In front of Dr. Pierce, 3 business families, and 9 other people. You did not correct yourself. You turned back to Alton and continued the conversation. And Honoria sat at the foot of your table and smiled. And you did not see what that smile cost her." Ellsworth's jaw tightened. It was a slip. It was 9 years in a single sentence. Pierce stood. "She didn't leave because you said the wrong thing. She left because the wrong thing proved something she had suspected for years. That to you, the woman at the foot of your table was a function. Useful. Reliable. The name attached to the function was secondary. The word sat in the room between them." "That's not true," Ellsworth said. "Then tell me who she corresponds with in Atlanta." Silence. "Tell me what she redirected the conversation away from on Tuesday, to keep your Savannah partners from reading Alton as a threat. Tell me the name of the woman whose inheritance petition she helped resolve last winter, through letters you never saw, because she knew you'd find it unnecessary." Pierce picked up his hat. "You are not a bad man, Ellsworth. But you have been married to a remarkable woman for 9 years, and treated her like excellent machinery, and she has decided she would rather be a person somewhere else than machinery in a very fine house." He paused at the door. "I'll make inquiries. But when you find her, consider what you intend to do. Because if you go to her expecting her to come home and resume her position, you will lose her permanently. And that will be entirely your own doing." He left. The house deteriorated faster than Ellsworth expected. On the 3rd day, the kitchen served the wrong menu to a lunch with 2 county commissioners, one of whom had avoided a specific dish for years in ways he had never announced. Honoria had always known. The kitchen had always been told accordingly. No one had thought to tell anyone else. On the 5th day, a merchant in Atlanta wrote to inform him that the credit arrangement for the household's fabric and dry goods had lapsed and required renegotiation, and that Mrs. Vane had always handled this directly and had saved them what amounted to $40 a year through precision attention to the contract terms. On the 7th day, he overheard 2 kitchen girls talking in the back passage. "She's not coming back," one said. "Not from this." "How do you know?" "Because I saw her face the last night. That wasn't a woman going on a visit." Ellsworth walked past without acknowledging he had heard. He went to his study and opened the household ledger Honoria had left. Every entry in her precise, controlled hand, every figure correct, every reference cross-notated. She had prepared for this. Not recently. The preparation had the texture of years, not the leaving, the preparation. By the end of the 2nd week, the county had begun to speak carefully, in the way that Georgia society had perfected, asking not where Mrs. Vane was, but whether Mr. Vane had heard from his wife lately, whether she was well, whether she was, and here the inflection carried everything, still traveling. He answered every inquiry with composed certainty. She was visiting family, she would return shortly. But the inquiries kept coming. At a meeting of the Savannah Commercial Association, a meeting he had been cultivating for 2 years, a man named Hollister pulled him aside before proceedings began and said quietly, like a man reading aloud from a letter the recipient had not yet received, "There's talk, Ellsworth. I thought you should hear it from someone who means it kindly." "Talk," Ellsworth said. "About your dinner. About the name." A pause. People aren't asking what she did. They're asking what you did. I didn't do anything. Hollister looked at him with the expression of a man who understood that this answer, while accurate in one sense, was precisely wrong in every other. That, he said carefully, may be exactly the problem. He walked away. Ellsworth stood where he was. He had spent 9 years building a public reputation as a capable man, a man of standing, a man whose household was a model of the right ordering of Georgia society. And Honoria had been the quiet architecture of all of it, invisible the way load-bearing walls are invisible, noticed only when they're gone, and the ceiling begins to shift. He had not understood until this moment that his reputation and her absence were not separate problems. They were the same problem. Pierce came back on the 19th day. He had information. He did not offer it directly. "Before I tell you where she is," he said, "I need to know what you intend." "I intend to bring her home." "No." Pierce set down his coffee. "You don't bring Honoria anywhere, you ask. And the answer may be no. She is my wife. She is a woman who left you a letter telling you what the marriage had cost her, who has been living independently for 19 days, without sending for help or returning or giving any indication that she intends to. She is not lost, Ellsworth. She left. There is a very significant difference." The room was quiet. "Where is she?" "Atlanta. She found lodgings through one of the women she had been corresponding with, the widow cases." Pierce paused. "She's working, formally. 3 families in less than 3 weeks, all women with complicated property situations, and no one who knows how to navigate the courts on their behalf." Ellsworth said nothing. "She's good at it," Pierce said, and there was something in his voice that lived between admiration and sorrow. The kind of good that makes a man understand she was doing this work for half her life without anyone calling it that. The silence that followed had a different quality. "She refused to see me," Pierce continued. "Politely. Completely. She sent down word that she was not receiving visitors connected to the Vane household. And the woman who answered the door delivered it with the calm of someone who had been given those instructions and intended to honor them." Ellsworth looked up. "She has a housekeeper. She has a life, Ellsworth. That is what I have been trying to tell you." The silence that followed had a weight he had not anticipated. "I called her my sister," Ellsworth said. "In front of everyone, yes, and I didn't." He stopped. Pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "I didn't know I'd done it. I know you didn't. That's worse, isn't it?" Pierce said nothing, because the answer was yes, and Ellsworth had arrived there on his own. Ellsworth stood and walked to the window that faced the front drive, the drive Honoria had walked down in the dark 3 weeks ago, with a single bag and 9 years of quiet erosion. "What do I do?" he said, and for the first time in 19 days the question was real. Not rhetorical, not a complaint. The stripped-down question of a man who did not know the answer. Pierce considered it for a long moment. "You start by understanding that this is not a problem to be solved. It is a wrong to be acknowledged. Those are not the same thing, and they do not use the same tools. The tools that have made you effective in every other area of your life will not work here." He stood. "And then you wait. Because she is not going to move toward you until she believes, not because you've told her but because she has seen it, that the man who comes to her is different from the man she left. And if she never believes it." He picked up his hat. "You will have spent 9 years beside a remarkable woman without ever knowing it until she was gone. I hope it doesn't come to that. But you need to understand that it might." He left. Ellsworth stood at the window for a long time. The estate lay still around him in the August heat. Everything he had built, everything he had assumed would simply continue to be there because it always had been. He rode to Atlanta on a Wednesday. He did not send word ahead. He told himself it was because he didn't want to give her the opportunity to refuse him before he'd had the chance to speak. But the truth, the one he didn't say aloud even to himself, was simpler and more uncomfortable. He was afraid that if he sent word, the refusal would come in writing, and he wasn't ready to hold that in his hands. He had spent 4 days since Pierce's visit doing something he had not done in his adult life with any genuine commitment. He had sat still and thought about Honoria, not about how to manage the situation, not about the practical damage or the social cost. About her, the actual woman. The way she had paused in a conversation to find exactly the right word and always found it. The way she had moved through the Alton dinner without appearing to manage anything, reading the entire room while everyone else saw only their own corner of it. The way she had looked at him sometimes, briefly, with an expression he had never stopped long enough to read. He understood now, with a cold clarity he had not invited, that the expression had been grief. She had been grieving quietly for years, and he had looked at it and moved on to the next thing. He arrived at the address. Pierce had given him mid-morning. A small house on a respectable street in the Inman Park neighborhood. The kind of house that announced its occupant had chosen it with intention rather than landed there by necessity. He knocked. A woman answered. Middle-aged, composed, with the steady eyes of someone carrying specific instructions. "I'm here to see Mrs. Vane," he said. "Your name's Sir Ellsworth Vane." The woman looked at him, without unkindness. "Mrs. Vane is not receiving visitors connected to the Vane household. I am her husband." She did not move. Then she held out a folded note. "She asked me to give you this. I am well. I ask that you respect my time. I am not ready to speak with you." No signature. He stood on that doorstep holding 3 sentences and understood, with a force that no negotiation had ever produced in him, that he had absolutely no power here. He was a man of property and contracts and standing, and he was standing outside a small house in Atlanta, holding a note from a woman who had decided with complete composure that she was not ready to see him. And there was nothing, not money, not influence, not argument, that was going to change that. He did not leave Atlanta. He sent a letter the following morning. He had written and discarded 5 versions before settling on 3 sentences, because every longer version had turned into a man arguing his case. And he had finally understood, with Pierce's voice somewhere behind his thoughts, that this was not a case to be argued. "I am not here to ask you to come home. I am here because I owe you an apology I do not know how to write. I would be grateful for the chance to attempt it in person, at a time and in a setting entirely of your choosing." He waited 2 days. Her reply came on a Sunday, in Honoria's precise controlled hand on plain paper. "There is a public lecture at the Atlanta Athenaeum on Tuesday evening. Mrs. Caroline Merritt speaks on the legal standing of women in Georgia property disputes. I will be attending. I will not be attending with you, but I will not prevent you from attending the same public event." He read it 3 times. It was not an invitation. It was not forgiveness. It was Honoria operating with her characteristic precision, drawing a line and leaving a door unlocked at the same time. He wrote back 1 word. Tuesday. He arrived early and took a seat near the back. Not where Ellsworth Vane of Vane Mill normally sat at any public event in his life. He sat near the back, because he was not there as a man of standing. He was there as a man who had earned the right to nothing beyond being in the same room. The hall filled. Mrs. Merritt began. Honoria arrived 7 minutes late with a woman he didn't recognize, 50s, plainly dressed, who deferred to Honoria in the small precise ways that indicated Honoria was the one who knew this room and she was the one being shown it. They found seats near the front. Honoria removed her gloves and opened a small notebook and did not look toward the back of the hall. Ellsworth watched her for nearly an hour. He had been married to her for 9 years and he was watching her now as though for the first time. She asked a question during the lecture. Clear, specific, better formed than most of what the men in the room had offered. Mrs. Merritt answered it with the slightly surprised respect of someone encountering a sharper mind than expected. The woman beside Honoria touched her arm briefly, the way you touch someone's arm when you're proud of them. Honoria smiled, a small private smile, not performed, not managed. Not the smile from the dinner table. That smile had been a door closing. This one was simply open. Afterward, in the general movement of people collecting themselves and filing toward the exits, Honoria turned. She had known he was there. Of course she had. He understood that now. She had located him upon entering, processed the information, and returned her attention to the lecture. She did not come to him. She stood near her seat and waited while the crowd thinned. When there was space enough, he walked to her. They stood 3 feet apart. "Honoria," he said. "Ellsworth." Her voice was even, not cold, not warm. The careful neutrality of someone taking this 1 minute at a time. "You look well," he said, and meant it with a specificity he hadn't anticipated. Because she did look well, and not in the managed, maintained way of a woman keeping up appearances. In the way of a person who has found the temperature of her own life and settled into it. "I am well," she said. Mrs. Merritt's argument on intestate succession could go further, but the framework is sound. She said it without performance, the way she always had. He had just never stood still long enough to see it as its own thing, rather than background. He stopped. Started differently. "I wrote to you. I said I owed you an apology. I still do. I find I don't entirely know how to make it, because I keep starting from the wrong place." Honoria was very still. "What's the wrong place?" "Explaining myself. Accounting for what I meant, or didn't mean. Every version I've written starts with me, and that's the problem, isn't it? Every version of everything for 9 years started with me." The hall was nearly empty. The woman Honoria had arrived with stood near the door, giving them distance with the tact of someone who had been briefed. Honoria looked at him for a long moment. "What are you asking, Ellsworth?" I'm asking if you'll allow me to call on you. Not to persuade you, not to. He stopped. I have things I'd like to say that are not arguments. I would like to say them to your face, because I think you deserve that, and then whatever you decide, I will accept. Honoria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and entirely precise. I do not think your regret is the same thing as my safety. The words went into him like a key turning. He did not answer immediately. There was no immediate answer that would have been worth anything. He stood with it. And she watched him stand with it, and the fact that he didn't argue or redirect or reframe registered somewhere in her expression. Not as forgiveness, as information. No, he said finally, it isn't, you're right. She held his gaze for another moment. I walk in Piedmont Park on Thursday mornings, she said. I am there from 9 until 10. I am not inviting you to join me. I am telling you where I am. What you do with that is your business. She collected her notebook and her gloves. Good evening, Ellsworth. She walked to the door, said something brief and warm to the woman waiting there, and they left together. Ellsworth stood in the emptied hall for a considerable while. I do not think your regret is the same thing as my safety. He turned it over, not as a wound, as a truth. The kind that once you've heard it clearly, you cannot argue yourself out of again. He was in the park at 8:45 on Thursday. Honoria arrived at precisely 9. She was with a woman he had since learned was named Mrs. Dunlap, a widow who had moved into the house with her, and who, by all accounts, argued with her about Georgia property law over supper with genuine pleasure. Mrs. Dunlap looked at him with the frank assessment of a woman conducting her own evaluation, then moved to a different section of the path without being asked. Honoria sat on the far end of a bench, measured distance, not far, not close. You came, she said. You told me where you'd be. I also said it wasn't an invitation. I know. He looked at her. I thought you'd probably expected me anyway. Something moved briefly across her face. Almost not quite humor. Yes, she said. I had. He drew a breath. When Pierce told me what you were doing, the property cases, the families you were helping, he said you were good at it. The way he said it, I realized I had no right to be surprised. I had watched you do the same work for our household for 9 years, and I had never called it work, never called it intelligence. I called it managing things. The way you'd say the clock keeps good time. Usefulness, never acknowledgement. Honoria was quiet. I called you my sister, he said, in front of everyone, and I didn't know I'd done it. That is the thing I cannot get past, Honoria. Not that I said it, that it came out of me that easily. As though the name attached to the woman at my table had stopped mattering enough to retain. His voice had lowered. He was not performing this. She would have known if he were. I have been trying to understand how I became a man who did that to you of all people, and I keep arriving at the same answer. I never had to try. You made everything work so completely that I never had to try. And I mistook that for everything being fine. Honoria said, it wasn't fine, I know. It hadn't been fine for years. You didn't want to know it then. The honesty of that landed between them, clean and undecorated. No, he said, I didn't. It would have required something from me that was easier not to give. She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd sat down. Her face was composed, but the composition was real rather than performed. This was Honoria, without the management layer. He had almost never seen this. What do you want, Ellsworth? Truthfully, he held her gaze. I want to know you the way I should have wanted to know you 9 years ago. The way any person deserves to be known by the person they live beside. That's not the same as wanting me back. No, he said. It isn't. I'm not asking you back. He looked down briefly, then up. I understand that what I'm asking for is something I have no right to. I'm asking anyway, because the alternative is going home and spending the rest of my life in a house that runs perfectly and is completely empty of everything that made it worth living in. Honoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, come back Saturday, same time. He was very still. To talk. She stood. I am not promising you anything beyond Saturday, Ellsworth. And if you come here with the intention of working toward a specific outcome, I will end the conversation immediately, and I will not offer another. Understood? She held his gaze one moment longer. Then she called to Mrs. Dunlap, who came forward with the expression of a woman who had been watching at a polite distance and had formed several opinions she intended to share. They walked away together down the path. Ellsworth sat on the bench and did not move for a long time. He had come to Atlanta expecting to retrieve something. He understood now, sitting in the park she walked through every Thursday morning, that what he actually needed to do was far harder and far more uncertain than retrieval. The letters started in the 4th week. He began writing to her between their park meetings. Not arguments, not appeals, Letters that were more like thinking out loud. He wrote about what Pierce had said in the study, the exact words, because he thought she deserved to know how the conversation had gone. He wrote about standing at the window and understanding that the house wasn't failing. He was the one failing. He wrote one letter, briefly, about his father, a man who had conducted his marriage as a well-run business arrangement, and taught his son, without ever saying so directly, that a husband who spoke his fears to his wife had failed some essential standard. He wrote it, not as an excuse, but as something he was still working through. Honoria read every letter. She replied to some, briefly, precisely, without warmth but without coldness. She confirmed she had read what he'd written. She responded to specific points. She did not volunteer more than the exchange required. It was Pierce who told her, in a separate note of his own, that Ellsworth read her non-replies as carefully as her replies, that he had said her silences had always carried information, if a person was paying attention. "He is paying attention now," Pierce wrote, "for whatever that is worth to you." Honoria folded the note and put it in a small box where she kept things that needed more time. The break, when it came, did not come from a conversation. Honoria arrived at the office of a solicitor named Cabot on a Thursday morning with Mrs. Pruitt, a 51-year-old widow whose late husband had died without a will, and whose eldest son was contesting her right to the family's textile business. Honoria had been preparing this case for 7 weeks. She knew the legal precedent. She had identified 2 statutory arguments Cabot himself had not raised. Cabot reviewed the documents with the particular brand of tolerant condescension that capable women had been navigating in professional offices for generations. He acknowledged the precedents with a slight pause of a man who had not expected to find them there. Then he mentioned, as an aside, that Mr. Ellsworth Vane of Savannah had recently made a contribution to the Atlanta Women's Property Legal Aid Fund. A sum Cabot described as not inconsiderable, made without conditions, without his name attached to any public announcement, with the specific written request that funds be directed toward contested inheritance cases. Honoria went very still. He asked that no credit be given, Cabot said, which is unusual. Most men who give that kind of money want it on a building somewhere. Mrs. Pruitt was watching Honoria. "When did this happen?" Honoria said. 3 weeks ago, I believe. I assumed you knew. I did not." She kept her voice level. She finished the meeting. She walked Mrs. Pruitt home, said goodbye with her usual warmth, and then walked back to her own house and stood in the front room without removing her coat. 3 weeks ago, before their last 3 park meetings, before 2 of his letters. He had done it quietly, without telling her, without using it as evidence in whatever case he was building. She had found out through a solicitor who assumed she already knew. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to her correspondence box and read Pierce's note again. He is paying attention now. The feeling that moved through her was complicated in a way she hadn't prepared for, not the simple warmth of being won over. Something sharper, the grief under the warmth, the recognition that this man, this version of him, had been possible all along, had been in there somewhere for 9 years. And she had waited and managed and made herself smaller by degrees and waited some more, and he had never arrived until she left. She sat down by the window and let herself feel that, not as a weapon, just honestly, because it was real, and it was hers, because she had spent too many years not permitting herself her own feelings on the grounds that they were inconvenient. Mrs. Dunlap found her there an hour later. "You've had news," she said. "He gave money to Cabot's fund, 3 weeks ago, without telling me." Mrs. Dunlap sat across from her. "He didn't use it." "No," a silence. "Well," Mrs. Dunlap said finally, "that's a different kind of thing." "Yes," Honoria said. "It is." She did not bring it up the following Thursday. She had intended to, but when she sat down and looked at him, something stopped her. He was thinner than he had been in the summer, not dramatically but enough. He had the look of a man who had not been sleeping well and had stopped concealing it. He asked about Mrs. Pruitt's case before she could say anything, because she had mentioned it the week before and he had remembered. She watched him listen. She watched him ask specific questions, follow-up questions, questions that connected to what she had said the week before. It was, she recognized with a feeling she didn't entirely welcome, the kind of attention she had wanted from him for 9 years. She did not say this. She kept it close, the way you keep anything new and uncertain. Pierce arrived at her door on a Friday afternoon in October, with the careful expression of a man carrying news he hadn't finished deciding how to deliver. She gave him coffee, because Pierce was not the Vane household, and she had no prohibition against Pierce, and because he looked like he needed to sit down. He signed documents. Pierce said. Honoria set her cup down. "What documents?" "Independent property settlement in your name. Formal and final. Consulted 2 attorneys and a judge. Pierce looked at her steadily. If you choose never to return to the marriage, you have legal financial security that cannot be contested. If you choose to return, it remains yours regardless. He does not control it. He cannot access it. It is yours in a way that Georgia law almost never gives a married woman anything. He paused. He asked me to tell you, because he said he couldn't tell you himself without it feeling like a transaction. He said he understood it was not leverage. He said, and here Pierce paused again, choosing words with care, that it was the first real thing he could actually do. Honoria was quiet for a long moment. The same week as the fund contribution, she said slowly. The same week, she stood and walked to the window. He did both of those things, she said, before any of our recent conversations, before the letters about his father. He wasn't holding them. He wasn't waiting to use them. No, he wasn't. Pierce. She turned. Her eyes were bright with something more complex than tears. Is he different? Genuinely. Not because I'm gone and he's uncomfortable. Actually different. Pierce considered this with the care of a man who understood exactly how much weight the answer carried. I think, he said carefully, that he has understood something he cannot ununderstand. Whether that changes a man permanently, I cannot promise. What I can tell you is that the Ellsworth who sat in his study and asked me what he should do sounded nothing like the man who sat in that same study 6 weeks ago and told me you were making a point and would be back by Tuesday. He leaned forward slightly. Something broke open in him. I believe it's real. I cannot guarantee it stays open. Honoria nodded. That's an honest answer. You asked for one. You're one of the very few people who gives them to me. He looked at her. What are you going to do? I'm going to ask him something, she said, and the answer will tell me most of what I need to know. She sent a note that evening. Come Thursday at 8, not 9. I would like more time. He arrived at 10 minutes to 8. She was already there. They sat through the first few minutes the ordinary way. Mrs. Pruitt's case, the weather turning. Then she said, I know about the settlement documents. He looked at her. Pierce told you. Yes. He nodded. I asked him to. I couldn't tell you myself without it sounding like evidence, like I was presenting a case. He paused. I didn't want it to be that. What did you want it to be? Something I should have done years ago, he said. Before you had any reason to need it. Before there was anything to prove. Just. He looked down briefly, then back. Just something a man does for a woman he respects. Honoria sat with that. Then she said, why didn't you? Before any of this. It was the question under everything. He was quiet for a long time, not evasive, sitting with it honestly. Because it didn't occur to me, he said. And it didn't occur to me, because I had never thought about what you needed. I thought about what I needed. The mill. The contracts. The standing in the county. And you were part of how all of that functioned. And I told myself that providing for you, maintaining the house and the position and the social standing, I told myself that was the same thing as caring for you. He looked at her directly. It wasn't the same. I understand that now. It was the easiest possible version of the obligation, and I dressed it up as the complete one. Honoria held his gaze. I spent 9 years, she said, being grateful for the provision because I had been taught that was what I was supposed to be grateful for, that it was enough. Her voice was steady, but something underneath was not. I told myself I was being reasonable, that I was managing a life most women would be glad to have, and all the while I was disappearing, in very small increments, so slowly I almost didn't notice. I noticed once, he said quietly. About 5 years in, I noticed you had stopped talking at dinner. Not stopped speaking, stopped talking, and I thought you were tired from the season. He paused. I had the kitchen prepare your favorite dishes for a week, and I told myself you seemed better. Honoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I did seem better that week. Because I thought, she stopped. Her voice held. I thought you had seen me. I thought that week meant you were paying attention. And when it didn't continue, when it went back to what it had always been, I think that was the week I started to understand that I was in every way that mattered, on my own. The honesty of that landed between them and stayed. Ellsworth said nothing for a moment. Something in his jaw worked briefly. He was not a man who cried, and he was not crying now, but his face was very close to the edge of something. I'm sorry, Honoria, he said. Not for the dinner, not only for the name, for 5 years ago, for all the years ago. She looked at him. I know, she said, and she meant it, not as absolution. Not as permission to reset the clock, just as the acknowledgement of something real. She asked him the question she had come to ask. If I told you, she said carefully, that I would never come back to the marriage as it was, that I would keep this house, keep my work, keep my independence in this city, in these circles, in this work that matters. Would you still want to be in my life? He did not hesitate. Yes, not because you're hoping I'll change my mind eventually, not because of that. Because you actually want to know me. On whatever terms are possible, Yes, he said. That's exactly it. She studied his face. Most men would find that arrangement unsatisfying. A wife who lives separately, who does public work, who is visible in ways that complicate your standing. Your business partners will have opinions. They already do, he said. I find I care considerably less about that than I did in August. He held her gaze. Honoria. I spent 38 years building a life that looked right from the outside and discovered the moment you left that I had no idea what it felt like from the inside. I don't want a life that looks right anymore. I want one that is. And you are the only person I have ever known who seemed to understand instinctively what the difference was. She was quiet for a long time. The park around them was filling with the slow movement of a Thursday morning, other walkers, other conversations, the ordinary life of Atlanta in October. Honoria sat in the middle of it and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not safety, not yet, but the beginning of the conditions under which safety might become possible. Come back Saturday, she said. He went very still. You said Thursdays. I'm changing the terms. I want to see you twice a week. She stood and smoothed her coat and looked at him directly. Don't be late. I won't be, and Ellsworth. She held his gaze a moment longer. I am not promising you anything beyond the next conversation. I need you to hear that clearly. I hear it. But I am. She paused. Chose the words with care, no longer assuming the worst of what you might become. That is not a small thing coming from me. I want you to understand what it costs to get there. He stood. I won't waste it, he said. She called to Mrs. Dunlap, who came forward with the expression of a woman who had been watching carefully from a polite distance and had formed conclusions she planned to share in detail over supper. Honoria walked toward her. Behind her, Ellsworth Vane stood in the October morning and did not move for a long time. Not because he was uncertain, because stillness felt, for the first time in his life, like the right way to hold something without breaking it again. He had come to Atlanta intending to retrieve his wife. What he was being offered, slowly, carefully, on terms entirely her own, was something he had never possessed in the first place. The chance to deserve her. He intended to take it. 3 weeks later, at a public forum on Georgia property law held at the Atlanta Athenaeum, Honoria raised her hand from her seat in the third row and asked a question. Precise. Specific. Better formed than anything else asked in that room that evening. The speaker paused, answered, conceded a point. The room shifted with the particular quality it gets when someone asks something unmistakably better than the lecture it follows. A man near the front leaned toward his companion and said, low but not quite low enough, who is she? Before the companion could answer, Ellsworth Vane, seated 2 rows back, said clearly and without being asked, Mrs. Honoria Vane. She organized the Atlanta Women's Property Legal Aid work. There is no one in this room who understands Georgia property courts the way she does. The man turned, recognized Ellsworth, nodded with the recalibrated respect of someone updating their understanding. Honoria, 4 rows forward, heard it. She did not turn around immediately. She let the moment move through her. The way something genuinely new moves through a person who has waited a long time for it, without quite believing it was coming. Then she turned her head, just slightly, just enough. Ellsworth was looking at her, not with the absent expression of a man registering a sound, not with the managed composure of a man maintaining appearances. With attention, full, unperformed, unhurried attention, the look of a man who saw the woman in front of him and knew exactly who she was. Honoria Vane looked back at him across those rows and smiled. Not the smile she had worn at the dinner table in August, the one that had been a door closing. Not the careful, composed smile of 9 years of making everything work without credit. This smile was different. It was the smile of a woman who had walked out of a beautiful house before dawn with one bag and her own name, and the terrifying freedom of someone who had stopped accepting a life that required her to disappear, who had built something real in a small Atlanta house, with a widow who argued with her about property law, and a collection of women who needed exactly what she knew how to give, who had sat across a small table and offered terms on her own authority, and watched the man she had once given everything to choose, with his eyes open, and nothing to gain but the truth, to meet her on her ground. It was the smile of a woman who had not left to punish anyone, who had left because staying had become a way of betraying herself, who had discovered, on the other side of that leaving, that she was not someone who needed to be retrieved or restored. She was someone who needed to be seen, And finally, in an Atlanta lecture hall in a November evening, in the voice of a man who said her name clearly and without hesitation in front of everyone, she had become. She was. Honoria turned back to the speaker, raised her notes, and continued her argument. She had work to do.